Hi, Leah. This is Ira, and I'm recording here my audio feedback on your Literacies of Struggle paper. My hope is that this feedback will be useful to you as you're working on the final project and thinking about the ways in which that final project participates in or forwards the No Dapple movement's particular literacy of struggle. And so basically, my comments here are really not so much evaluative of the literacies of struggle paper. You did a great job on that, but rather meant to push you to think more fully or more systematically about some questions, and also meant to give you just some general suggestions about writing in just for future reference, I guess, basically. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read back through your paper again, and as I'm reading it through this time, I'm going to be highlighting different sections where I think you wrote about things in a particularly strong or compelling way, and I'm also going to highlight different sections where I want to kind of push you or challenge you a little bit in your thinking, and especially where I think that might be useful for you as you're working on the final project. So. I like this way of starting by thinking about a definition that is almost immediately presented as not quite full enough, not complete enough. So I think that's kind of a cool way to begin, just as a writerly way of working. And so you start by saying, at first glance, literacies of struggle are simply the readings and writings of a group of people or individuals who have a voice that is not often heard. Their intent is to be noticed. And so what I hear you saying is literacies of struggle are the writings and reading. So really the textual production or the symbolic production, the discourse of minoritized or marginalized people or groups. And the goal is simply to make themselves heard, to be noticed. And you say the thing we need to say we need to think about to go beyond that is to say the want and need for an outcome in favor for the movement. And this is I think that's important, like to think about literacies of struggle as oriented towards outcomes, not just expression. And it'd be interesting to hear more about what you see as a relationship between outcomes and expression, how these two things fit together, how their intention for any given literacy of struggle. And then you go to Burke and Ansaldua as a way of thinking about this definition from two different angles, which I think is cool. And do a nice job of summarizing Burke and also noting that indeed he interprets the effects of the dramatistic through a scientistic lens. And so you're observing that although he's distinguishing between the scientistic and the dramatistic, his piece itself inclines toward the scientistic, in effect. I think one thing you can do here and in general throughout when you're talking about authors who have written about key concepts that you're going to build with, I encourage you to quote a little more directly from the authors themselves, and then also do a little more explaining of specific quotes. So for instance, like, this is great. It's really important to your way of thinking, I think, here, the idea of directing the intention. And so I think, like, that's an important thing to take from Burke, but it's also important to take that he's really also talking about there directing the attention, and that directing the attention and directing the intention are closely interwoven. And so this would be a good spot to have like a substantive quote from Burke and then another 2 or 3 sentences just explaining exactly what's happening in that quote. Why is he saying this. Basically, doing that helps you build your argument in a way that's more deeply attuned to the pieces that you are quoting. And that's sort of the same thing with Ansel Dua, same thing with Wisner and Brandt, etc. So, like, for instance, I think actually when you say that, whereas Burke's writings themselves are a scientistic screen, Ansel Dua's writing is dramatistic. I think that's actually a really smart observation and an important one. And I think for you to really deepen it and draw it out more fully, it'd be useful to have like a specific line or two from Ansel Dua. So you do a good job summarizing like what she's up to and how that's kind of more dramatistic. But I think another quote and unpacking of a quote would help you really deepen that. And essentially, I'd say the same for both Wisner and Brandt. So in both cases, you do, as you do with all of these authors, you do a good job of summarizing like a core idea for the author. And your position as a writer will be stronger, more compelling if that summary of a core position for the author is more deeply worked out in the text of the author. So you're quoting from them and then you're unpacking the quote. You're quoting and you're unpacking the quote. And you're using that to sort of add depth to your summary and also and importantly, to help tie your definition to specific moments in the text. So that's a little bit, that's a little bit about how you can, just sort of thinking towards the future in general, how you can do theory building in a way that's a little more deeply tethered. Because I think you're thinking in smart ways here, and from a writerly perspective, it'd be good to see it be a little more closely tethered to the actual, to the actual text that you're drawing on to work with for your theory. I thought your investigating of Dapple was like a nice, you start off with a nice, like, quick, and in general, this is something, it's a real strength of yours as a writer. You're good at the quick summary, like that gets to the relevant key points, and that's a real strength. And you know that, like, and I think this is really, really an important thing for thinking about what's at stake rhetorically in No Dapple is, first, there were successful protests that altered the plans to move the pipeline away from the reservation. So, like, the No Dapple, in a sense, and this is something we didn't really talk about a lot in class, but is built on not just a historical foundation with like the American Indian movement or Alcatraz and so on and so forth, but also actually like really directly on a foundation of some rhetorical success, right? So there were protests, there was pushback, and through the pushback of the Oglala Sioux at that moment, there was the Standing Rock Sioux at that moment, there was... They had some actual material success in their initial rhetorical efforts, but as you know, then the plans were redrawn to extend beneath Lake Oahe, the nation's main water source. So nothing ultimately changed, and I think that's that's really important. So it's like, on the one hand, there were some initial functional, effective rhetorical activities. The literacies of struggle produced by the No Dapple movement includes whatever was said and done in those initial protests, and those initial protests weren't really enough to make the change in a substantive way. And so one thing that would be kind of interesting to know is, what did the new protests look like relative to the original protests? In other words, how is the rhetoric of the new protests similar to and or different from the rhetoric of the first protests, and why? What's changing there? And that's not just a general question. That's a question that helps us understand the way that literacy of struggle is developing. Yeah, and so I think one of the things that you do here that's, and I'm going to come back in a sec, but I just want to kind of remember. Yeah. So one of the things that you do here that is interesting, and I'm going to kind of go through it, is you talk at some length about this Real Clear Energy article. And I think that's interesting and useful. When you say a journalist for Real Clear Energy, an online magazine based in Chicago, you probably want to think also about like, okay, but who's it published by? Where's the money behind Real Clear Energy? What is the name of that journalistic outlet mean in this context? What does it tell us? How does it frame things? You talk about Berg, and I think Berg is great actually to talk about here, and you use Berg well to talk about how that article itself works. What about the outlet in general? How can Berg tell us something about that as well? And what does it tell us about what kind of literacy is at stake here? And one of the things the reason I'm asking this is because, so essentially your discussion of this article, the Real Clear Energy article, which is again smart and interesting as like a way of thinking about the counter narrative to the No Dapple protests. One of the things that you're doing there is you're using that to say, well, my initial view needs to be broadened because we need to view counter-protests as also literacies of struggle. And I think that's really interesting. And I mean, I think it's a really interesting idea or way of thinking about literacies of struggle. And one of the things that I would want to know is, okay, cool, but why? Why should we call this a literacy of struggle? I'm not saying why should we allow it to exist. You make that point at the end of the essay, and I think you're perfectly correct. We do need to be able to have a wide range of conflicting views given space in public. I think that's important. But why call this literacy of struggle? What's at stake in that? When we think about this as a definition that you started with, why shift the definition away from minoritized groups to also include sort of agents of the status quo, or, you know what I mean, representatives of the more powerful positions? And I'm not saying you can't by any means, but rather asking you to explain why. What's the value of doing that? What does that help us understand about literacies of struggle that we wouldn't otherwise? Why would we call this, for instance, not just, I don't know, a reactionary or a counter protest? Why is it a literacy of struggle? So what makes it a literacy and what makes it a struggle? Because, so you say the Real Clear Energy article conforms to the definition of literacies of struggle. I'm not sure that it does to your initial definition. In this particular case, the writers in the magazine's negative view of the No Dapple movement is reflected in their article, and because of the magazine's online presence, they were successful in their intent to be heard. So I'm not seeing, so what about that is related to the initial definition? Because the initial definition had this piece where it has to be the readings and writings of a group of or people or individuals who have a voice that is not often heard. And I feel like, I don't know, is it really not often heard? The voice of the dominant kind of argument for pipelines? I feel like that's a voice we hear from a lot, isn't it? And if so, how does that change the definition and why? And if not, are you sure that this is really a literacy of struggle? So I think that's just sort of a theoretical piece to be worked out a little more fully. And then you come back to the native voices and concerns that are at stake in the in the No DAPL protests and the literacy struggle that they create. And here you do actually quote directly, which is awesome. And that's something that I would want to really strongly encourage you not just to do more of throughout the piece, but also to do more of with regard to the literacy of struggle, right? So if it's about literacy, we have to be looking at the textual production itself in some way. Otherwise, what makes it literacy exactly? So I think that you're starting to do that here in a really useful way, and I'd encourage you to do more of that in such moments. Obviously, this piece of writing is done, but this is sort of kind of helping you think about, in such moments, what can you do differently in ways that'll be useful for the argument. And so, like I said, one of the things I think you do really well here is actually quote directly from the different actors. So you've got 3 quotes from different participants in some way in No DAPL movement, or in the general literacy of struggle that's at stake here. And so one of the things that I would want to encourage you to do more of then is then tell us how these are linked. Help us see how these different quotes fit together. What does this quote from the Looming Indian Business Council have to do with the quote from the Navajo Nation and the quote from the Yavapai Nation? I mean, I'm not doubting at all that they're linked. I think that you're smart in thinking that they are, and that they're an important part of understanding the discourse that is produced when faced with the construction project that threatens the safety, sovereignty, and existence of a native nation. So I think again, you're making really good links here, and I'd want to encourage you to make those links more explicitly, make them more fully. So then, coming out to the end, this idea of meaningful results, I think that does seem like it's important that you say being noticed in and of itself should not be the single desired outcome for any struggle. That we need, when we think about literacies of struggle, we need to think bigger in a sense, really. We need to think about what effects are produced by the discourse. So, and you say we can now define literacies of struggle as the mass-produced mediums, whether it be art, writing, speaking, videography, or any other format, that are made by a group of people or individual who speak with the sole intent of starting a conversation and also bringing about a social systematic change. And I think that's a really strong definition. And at the same time, that does kind of trouble the inclusion of the Real Clear Politics piece, right? Because they're not really trying to bring out about a social or systematic change. They're trying to ensure that there not be a change to the existing plans, right? Or no? Is there something else happening there? So I think I think this new definition is actually really nice and quite strong, but it also kind of, to my reading, challenges your inclusion of one of the pieces that you're looking at as a literacy of struggle. One of the other thing I think you do here that's really important is that literacies of struggle can work in a variety of mediums. It's not just written text. And I think that's a really important point, really, really helpful and useful point. I think this idea that it's about a space where individuals who seemingly shouldn't share their literacies can. That seems, maybe that helps get at what's happening, why you're including the Real Clear Politics piece. If so, say more about that. This is a thing I think you might be onto something useful, and so think more about what does that mean exactly. This sentence I was a little confused by. Literacies of struggle are more often used by minoritized people like Native Americans. Cool. And although wrong, what's wrong here? I'm not clear. It's normal because what is the it? Because I'm a little confused with that one too. Because when the world sees privileged people protesting, they don't always seem to be for the right reasons. And this sentence I'm a little unclear, like what's exactly what the sentence means at the sentence level. So that's something to kind of keep an eye out for sentences that might be a little unclear, in part because it's unclear. It shows up, or they shows up, and it's unclear what they're referring back to. So that's just something to kind of keep an eye on as a writer. Think about. And I think that this notion that there will never be a time when literacies of struggle are not utilized, that can be sad and unreassuring, but it also means that people will continue to fight for a change they wish to see, and like anything ever, the world can always be improved. I think that's a nice sort of hopeful, it's a dark optimism, but it's an honest dark optimism to end on. And so I'm really excited to see your intervention. I'm looking forward to seeing that soon. And obviously I'm happy to meet and talk about it between now and when it's due. So if you'd like to, send me an email and make an appointment time. Otherwise, thanks for a great semester and for your really thoughtful engagement start to finish. Thanks a lot, Leah.